good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Uh, as most of you probably know, I'm Artis Bergsdottir and the organizer of the ROCKS lecture series. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing the ROCKS team member, Charlotte Christiansen, with her lecture on writing fish and venturing into deep water, insights from a literary anthropological research project in Iceland. A little bit about Charlotte. She has a PhD in anthropology from Aarhus University and has published several articles and chapters on literary practices, creativity, mental health, and cultural conceptions of literature. Her current project here in Iceland is an anthropology of literature and creativity in Iceland. So now, Charlotte, once again, welcome. I'm delighted to have you with us. And without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to you now.
Thanks. And hello to current and perhaps future listeners. Yes, my name is Charlotte Christiansen, and I am a Danish anthropologist. And I'm today going to tell you about this postdoc project that I'm working on, which is so fortunate to be affiliated with the ROCKS. So the overall project is called An Anthropology of Literature and Creativity in Iceland, Enchanted Landscapes. And I'm very grateful to the Carlsberg Foundation, who has chosen to support this project with a 2-year fully funded postdoc fellowship, and to the Árni Magnússon Institute in Reykjavik, who hosts the project. And of course, to all the different people, colleagues and interlocutors whom I've met so far, who have all been really helpful and curious towards all my questions and ideas. So the project, just to be clear, it runs from 2023 and until 2025. So I'm almost halfway in. And this talk today presents some preliminary findings. So the first year I have mostly been doing ethnographic fieldwork, and the coming year will mostly be analysis and dissemination. So today it's still a work in progress, fresh from the field, you could say. And I hope you bear this in mind, that it's also some unpolished ideas that I share today. So I'm going to talk about first some different entrances that I've had into this project, how it came into being. And then I'm going to share an ethnographic montage. And then I'm going to go a bit more into the background and methods of the project. And after this, I'll dive into even more ethnographic material and examples. And then I'll I'll round off with my preliminary analysis, how one could go about making sense of this. So I thought it might be interesting to begin by telling how this project started. Before I ventured out in this project, I did a PhD about shared reading groups in Denmark. I was allowed to follow and participate in a so-called literary empowerment program with an interdisciplinary group of researchers, and literary scholar Mette Stenberg was a PI. The Danish Reading Society, a socialist organization, offered live social reading for young people in Denmark who experienced mental health issues. And this was a big topic in political discussions at the time. So the background for this research was also that literature was increasingly used actively and socially between people in book clubs and on literary festivals and on social media. So this contrasted with the kind of classic image people usually think of the reader or writer who is sitting alone at home, immersed in a text. So in anthropology, most studies of literature have focused on how the ethnographer can get writing inspiration from reading fiction writers, or how reading a certain author, for example, reading Chekhov or Dostoevsky, can be a kind of gateway to get knowledge about Russian culture. But maybe these new active ways of using literature have also helped open anthropologists' eyes to the fact that it's possible to study literature, reading and writing as a field in its own right. So while I was trying to read my way into this growing field called literary anthropology, I read Helena Wulff's book, Rhythms of Writing, which presents a detailed study of writers in Ireland. And it struck me that Iceland would make for a good comparison. I had for a while been following the oppressive amount of literary works coming from our neighboring Nordic country, and they were often getting raving reviews in the Danish newspapers. Ireland and Iceland share many traits. They are former colonies on the margins of Europe. They have migration histories and have experienced famines and extreme poverty in the past. They both also struggled during the 2008 financial crisis, and they have a long, strong storytelling and musical tradition and a flourishing literary scene. But there was, of course, also some differences that would be interesting to explore. Notably, Icelandic writers publish in a very small language for a small population, so they need to be translated if they want to reach a wider audience, while most Irish writers can write in English as a first language. So the market prospects look very different. Secondly, of course, the landscapes are also very different. Iceland has a volcanic landscape and big parts of the land is uninhabited, where Ireland, it generally has these more lush green fields. So this was my first entrance into this project and an idea to see what these differences meant and to start building and comparing the knowledge from different literary ethnographies. A second entrance point to the project, which might be of bigger interest for people who are affiliated with the ROCs, is some theoretical conclusions that I also reached in the PhD. In the academic literature, I encountered quite a few descriptions of how the self is narratively shaped. Human lives are basically built of important events that are connected to each other through time. In this model, it can then be healing for people to reach new perspectives on their own life stories if they read literary narratives or write new stories themselves. This is often what is assumed when literature is offered to people who suffer in different ways. But in our material, in the research project, the literary practices were much more than narrative analysis. It was fragmented atmospheres, moments and production of spaces and places. It was also the ambiguous meeting with something completely unfathomable or unknown. So I reached the conclusion that it might be fruitful to move beyond perceiving literature as only a medium of meaning-making and explore how literary practices produce new moments and spaces in everyday life. From these new insights grew questions about interplays between different places and spaces and the literature that Icelandic writers were producing. Since the landscapes of Iceland seemed so all-encompassing, they seemed key in the national identity formation. One example is anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup's study, which has shown how Iceland's distinct tradition of storytelling and lyrical composition takes part in the constitution of the lived landscape. As landscapes and rural places have often also played a role in the contemporary literature, I have listed some examples here on this slide. This might also be an interesting path to follow. So the last entrance point is that thinking about these issues, I realized that it was, of course, important to take into consideration that landscape is not a pure or untouched nature, contrasting to the human town, for example. No such place exists anymore. Yet landscape implies also a person or a human who moves through it. So in a way, it points towards this, but I'm still not sure if it's the right term to use. Grappling with how to move beyond this old nature-culture divide, some recent dealings with what has been called the Anthropocene was helpful. Reading Annette Singh, Donna Haraway, and Nils Buband has disclosed the ways human and more than humans live in entanglements, assemblages that are dependent on each other in unpredictable ways. Notably, the Anthropocene is here and now. The planet is already damaged. In my understanding, they call for examinations of how humans and other beings carve out life in this third nature, damaged by mainly capitalist forces. In connection with this research, Natasha Myers has described that we are now at the edges of imagination, the limits of language, facing environmental catastrophe. Art and experiments are needed to develop new ways to feel, see, and know, to develop inventive forms of speculative fabulation, and tuning our senses towards the plant world that we are so dependent on. I thought that maybe looking into the practice of skilled writers could also teach us something about how to start dreaming worlds otherwise, as Myers calls for. So to sum up this long story, existing research on Icelandic literature had primarily focused on preserving and analyzing literary works. While I wanted to build on this research, I also wished to investigate contemporary literature from the viewpoint of the writers and users of this literature. Given the strong presence of landscape, I proposed that to investigate the production and uses of Icelandic literature was a fruitful entrance point to understand interplays between the environment, understood as co-constituted through human activities, and creative imagination. So I wanted to investigate, in collaboration with writers and other relevant actors, the creative production of texts with a particular focus on personal encounters with the landscape, such as the weather, sea, rocks, shadows, or glaciers, to be more specific. So my research questions they started out with, they can of course be mended along the way. But I wanted to ask, how do Icelandic authors write their texts, understood as a particular technology of imagination? What role does encounters with, attitudes towards, and imaginaries of the environment play in the writing process? And finally, how can a literary anthropological theoretical frame be developed to adequately attend to practices of literary writing? So, with all of this in the back of my mind, I moved to Reykjavik to meet and talk with writers and start finding out about some of these questions. So now I'm going to present an ethnographic montage. On a cold but sunny winter day, I attended a social lunch with a group of 20, 30-year-old women like myself in a Reykjavik suburb. We didn't know each other very well, so the talk skirted around a bit while we were waiting for everyone to arrive. We got to talk about the book club I was lucky to be a part of, together with two other attendees, Gudrun and Lina. Another woman asked us which titles we had read. Recently, we read Karl Ove Knausgård's My Struggle, we answered. Everybody read it 10 years ago, but none of us had read it back then. Now it felt almost like it was too late to read it, we explained. Books are like fish, continued Gudrun. You need to read them fresh when they come out and everybody talks about it. If you don't make it then, you'll never read it. Some months later, I was doing an interview with two literary critics. They talked about the frantic period in the fall called Jólabókaflóðið, where almost all books come out in Iceland and need to be reviewed. Being hired as a critic was often called being on vertith, one of them explained, an unfamiliar word to me. This is the same word used for people who are hired in seasonal work on the fish factories in the countryside, he explained. Then the books are the fish, he continued. It's a fresh product. You need to review it while it's fresh. Well, that's interesting, I said, and told them about my previous conversation about books as fish. This led us to discuss the abundance of water metaphors in the Icelandic literary scene. Take the Jólabókaflóðið, literally meaning the flood of Christmas books. Everything flows in a stream, the other chipped in. Then the books are the fish, the different fish you try to catch, the most beautiful fish. Maybe it's our island mentality, the first one mused. He continued. Maybe it had something to do with a plenary discussion that had been at the university last year, where books had been discussed as fresh produce. How the market was really fast. Right after Christmas, the book cost a third of their original price. And a couple of years later, you could hardly get a copy of it anymore. A little later again, over yet another lunch, I told another writer about the peculiar fish metaphors I had encountered. Maybe it also stemmed from Halldór Laxness's famous passage, he said, where he says that art is the wrapping around the fish. You need some björk to sell your cod, or some say the art is the pretty wrapping, he explained to me. I looked it up in Halldór Laxness's Brekkukots Arnald. In English translation, the fish can sing. Here, a character who owns a shop declares that cultural life needs to tie a bow around the fish if you want some direction for your nation and not just be a salt cod baron. The character declares this as they greet their former employee whom they had fired, but after this he went to Denmark and became a famous opera singer. It is perhaps not surprising that a country that has lived off fish uses many fish water metaphors in other parts of life. Nonetheless, I think it touches upon intersections between environments and literature, but in a quite other way than I had anticipated. Not so much the actual landscape of Iceland, but rather the way literature, writing, and the literary field was imagined as fish or water. Before I bring some more examples, I'm just going to present a little bit more about my methods. So the project primarily builds on interviews and conversations with writers and other relevant actors in the literary field, such as critics or publishers. I have formally interviewed 16 writers and 25 people in total. I have talked informally with many others. I have also done participant observation in literary events and had email correspondences, read other interviews in news media, and of course, I've been reading a lot of literary works. I'm doing some experiments and excursions to important places in Iceland, and I've also met informally with interlocutors in book clubs, as mentioned, for coffee and for lunch. Also, I would say living in Iceland for a little under a year now gives certain insights, the rhythms of the week and the rhythms of the year and its seasons. Practically being a writer myself, but of a different kind, I am studying sideways, as Ulf Hannertz has called it. Interviews were semi-structured, and they were recorded and transcribed. Epistemologically, the interview can be understood as a social construction of knowledge in the moment. This is probably particularly true with people in the world of cultural production, where performance, persona, and form are key. In a way, this study can be viewed as nothing but a performance of writing practices. So this is just to say, I do not claim to have found an ontological truth about writing practices. Furthermore, it is difficult to study the act of writing as it happens with ethnographic means. So this is mostly stories told afterwards. And I also want to say that the quotes I bring here are anonymized for now. In May 23, when I started out, there were 667 members of the Writers' Union of Iceland. So there is a question of choosing which writers to talk to. Here I saw some variation in terms of stages in their career, generation, nationality, gender, and age. One selection criterion was that writers were published and preferably translated. They were literary writers in the broad sense, so people writing prose and poetry, but not crime novels and not historical works or memoirs. Their works should in some ways relate to issues of landscape, climate change, the environment, or the more than human. Most people that I have talked to did not come from a particularly literary background, but were self-made. Older relatives had been farmers or fishermen and workers. Some lived completely as writers, while others had another job on the side. And the vast majority lived in Reykjavik. So I'm gonna go on and present some more ethnography now. Yeah, so how writing practices related to environments and landscapes. And I'm gonna bring some examples from different writers. So the first thing I'm gonna talk about is how to make use of one's environment in the process of getting ready to write. Here, the writer Louise found that swimming often helped, and Roysti and Björk needed to go for walks, and then, at some point, poetic lines or good sentences started coming up that needed to be noted down. Some writers, such as Gunnar, found that going to the countryside for a few days could help, and some had as a method to go to a summer house together and work and read to each other intensely for a weekend. Some writers took the next step and moved away from Reykjavik to live in a more quiet surroundings. One writer, Brimia, explained, "You can't just sit yourself," so this is a quote, he said, "You can't just sit yourself down and then you are creative. It's very much how you live, how you think. What are you looking at? What kinds of thoughts does that stir in you? You must be careful with what you're thinking of. The most important job is to protect your soul. That's why I chose to go into a kind of asylum and move to a faraway place. I try to use the landscape. I try to use what surrounds me." Dora, who was also a seasoned writer, also explained something similar. "The Icelandic landscape has been one of my greatest sources of inspiration," she said. "The ever-changing light in the sky, and this romantic landscape, which is at the same time so harsh, cruel. It's a strange combination that it clashes in your mind, which is very good." So, first of all, it seems that the actual landscape matters very much to get into the writing mode. But how about an imagined or virtual landscape, to borrow Deleuze's distinction? I encountered landscape metaphors for the process of writing itself, just like in the montage that I presented previously. So this was about an imagined metaphoric landscape. It was mostly water and fish, but also metaphors of farming. When actually writing, several writers described that they needed to stay on this knife's edge state of mind where they were swaying between the unknown unconscious and hard conscious decisions. Dora explained that first you had to let it flow, and then afterwards you could get cruel and tear it all apart, and then you approach something useful. Another writer, Gudrun, said that to access the high of writing, she needed to access the high of writing in order to be able to get to her creative source. And this was likened to the state of being really tired or hungover, and it could, for example, be reached just before falling asleep. This unknown was related to a sea by two different writers. Suna said, "The subconscious is like an ocean, it's so big, you can't know everything that's there. You can only know like a drop of the ocean at the time." She continued, "You have to be able to dwell in the unknown if you want to write literature and not genre literature. Ideas start forming, but you don't know where it's going or if it's any good. This can be very uncomfortable, but you must stick it out. Bremia explained how he worked as a fisherman when he was a student. He had a little boat, and his father and grandfather were also fishermen, and he likened the fishing process to writing. He said, "You plan to go out fishing. You go out, you get no fish. You go back to shore, you go out again. 10 days can pass with no fish. There is something bigger that controls. You cannot steer along. You just have to stay in it and adjust to it. You have to be humble. You cannot be the captain, more like the passenger." What kind of force? This is after I asked him, what is it that you need to be humble towards? And he says, what kind of force is this? It's difficult to say, to know. Maybe it's something in you. Maybe something wants to come out in the landscape. If things got too difficult, perhaps if it was too difficult to reach the mode of writing, one technique was to do crop rotation with your texts. Saiva's last book was dragging on. He had promised to deliver something soon, but he was exhausted. And then he said to me, "That's when I decided I just have to put that aside and do a fairy tale. I call it crop rotation. I think it's more in organic farming. You have barley one year, and then you have potatoes, then you have pumpkin, and then you have the cows. Just make it grow wild, and you just rest it for a year." So in 2000 and X, I was experiencing a super harvest year. So the last kind of landscape I want to talk about is the landscape or places portrayed in the written texts themselves. So I think this is yet another kind of landscape, virtual, like the metaphoric ones I just mentioned, but put into writing. Here, imaginings of actual landscapes or places or more than human phenomena could be used as a kind of writing engine to produce a virtual or a second version in text. Two different writers, Björk and Saiva, wrote about such particular places and particular plants, but to my surprise, they did not visit the places or see or engage with the actual plants. They preferred to remember it or imagine it. So in terms of the virtual landscapes and other non-human elements in the text themselves, they seem quite disassociated from the actual thing. Again, Dora's explanation might cast light on this. She mentioned a certain spectacular town in Iceland where you could see a glacier, the ocean, and really beautiful mountains all at once. But when she used it as a starting point for a place in the text, she went by her imagination. Afterwards, she could visit the place to pick things from reality for decoration. She said, "It's about freedom. You invent things that you would not have thought of if you started with reality. You get the text to a higher level, I think. You make things up. You cannot make up things if you just go by reality." So, to try and sum up, there are many different landscapes and other than human elements at play here. Some I would call virtual and some actual. Firstly, there is going into an actual or real landscape to get into the right mode for writing. Then there is talk of the state of writing as a landscape or a sea or a field. Then writing up a virtual landscape in your text. So this is often turning an actual landscape into a virtual or a more metaphoric one. One could say that it is analytic laziness to put all of this together here, and maybe it is. I'm not sure yet, but my point is also that for the writers that I met, it didn't seem, or it seemed like it was all part of their lived experience of moving between their inner imaginary worlds, part of which were unknown, and the actual world. Anthropologist Adam Reed's study of the Henry Williamson Society showed how readers were occupied with the literary places they read about in his novels, but they were also occupied with going to the actual places, and there was this whole interplay or exchange between the written and the real place. So my point with this is that it's not unreal or contradictory, perhaps, to the people who are engaged in it. So to round all of this off, I'm just going to try and point to some analytical paths that could be followed from this. Firstly, there are the many metaphors of fish and water when writers describe their books or the literary market or the process of writing. What are we to make of that? Lakoff and Johnson wrote the influential book, Metaphors We Live By. This was suggested by my colleague Heiko Ingvarsson to maybe go into this. And just to sum up, a metaphor is basically making sense of one thing through another kind of thing. They are everyday phenomena, we use them all the time, and they shape our language. And as it is concepts with which we perceive our world, they also shape our experience of our world. So what characterizes these metaphors I encountered? I think perhaps they were not only everyday metaphors, but also form part of a poetic construction when we did the interviews. They were ontological metaphors, making sense of something quite abstract through a more specific image. Maybe even an animification, if you can say that the book animated as a fish, a living being. And I don't think this is uncommon. I know David Lynch wrote a book called Catching the Big Fish about how to become creative in 2007. I think the image of the fish might connotate a certain urgency. When it is there and when it's fresh, you get it. Unpredictability, you don't know where the big stream of fish is or when it's gonna come. Everyday subsistence, fish has been a staple food for ages, and if there are no fish, your livelihood can be threatened. And then there is the other image of writing as being in water or being in the ocean. And this, I think, could connotate a force greater than you, abundancy, the unknown, kind of uncanny. You cannot know what is in the deep waters, and also a certain danger. You need to respect these forces of water, or they can be dangerous. The second metaphor that was used, the water metaphor, I think, was pointing to a kind of abstract, more than human force that you as a writer needed to submit to and let steer if you wanted to write. I think it pointed to a mode of being where you stay in or accept the still unknown and then go back to a more conscious state. And that made me think of Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble. In the introduction, she writes, "In fact, staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, and meaning." My thought was that maybe we can learn something from this mode of being that the writers describe. Haraway calls for becoming with this strange element of the non-human, and I think she's mostly talking about other companion species. Maybe we can learn something from this writing process about not hurrying into rationalizations right away, but trying to find ways to stay in the ambivalent, even though it's uncomfortable, because this is also where new constellations, in this case, new literary text, can be found. So I'm ending this now. I would be happy to discuss any questions, or you can always write me later. And thank you for listening.
For more information, visit ROCKS at www.rocks.ku.dk.